Margaret Calloway's hands were still bleeding when she slapped the forged land deed onto Jesse Hargrove's kitchen table. 4 days of frozen rain and bad roads spread across the wood like someone else's death sentence for him to sign. The rancher stared at her like she'd lost her mind, jaw set hard as iron. "Get off my land!" She didn't flinch, didn't move, just pressed 2 fingers to the document and said, "You don't have any land left, not if Aldous Briggs gets you to sign what he put in front of you this morning." The room stopped breathing. Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button right now and stay with this story all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that kitchen where everything was about to change. Margaret Calloway had not planned to bleed on a stranger's table. She'd planned to ride in hand over the documents, say her piece, and leave before sundown. Clean. Simple. The kind of transaction she'd learned to manage in 8 years of moving from one dying town to the next, do what needed doing, collect what little was owed, and disappear before anyone started asking questions she didn't want to answer. But the road from Cutter's Creek to the Hargrove Ranch was 4 miles of frozen mud and wind that cut like a blade, and somewhere around the 2nd mile her horse had shied at something in the dark, and her right hand had come down hard on a split fence rail. The gash across her palm wasn't deep enough to kill her. It was deep enough to leave a red smear on the corner of the deed she'd been carrying in her coat since Tuesday. She didn't notice until she'd already slapped it on the table. Jesse Hargrove noticed. His eyes dropped to the blood, then came back up to her face, and whatever he'd been about to say died somewhere behind his teeth. He was taller than she'd expected from what people said about him in town. Leaner. The kind of lean that came from years of not eating enough and working too hard, not from being young. His face was the face of a man who'd stopped being young a long time ago. "I don't know who you are," he said, "but you need to leave. My name is Margaret Calloway. I was a legal clerk for Judge Thomas Abernethy's circuit court out of Abilene for 8 years. She kept her voice flat, professional. The voice she used when she was reading a contract in front of men who didn't think she could read. Before that, my father kept books for Calloway Freight and Transport out of St. Louis, which means I've been reading land documents since I was 12 years old. She tapped the deed. This one is forged. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there with his arms crossed and his jaw working the way men's jaws worked when they were deciding whether to be angry or afraid. "Aldous Briggs brought that to you this morning," she said. "At the bank. I know because I was in the records office at the county courthouse when his clerk filed the companion document, the one that transfers water rights." She watched his face. "You didn't know about the water rights portion." It wasn't a question. She could see it in the way his shoulders dropped a 1/4 inch before he caught himself and locked them back into place. "You need to leave," he said again, but quieter this time. "Mr. Hargrove." "I said leave. The signature on the original grant from 1861 is W.H. Hargrove." She pointed to the bottom of the deed. "Your father's name was William Henry Hargrove, that's correct. But the ink used in the notarization stamp is iron gall. Iron gall wasn't used by West Texas County clerks until 1869. If your father filed this deed in 1861, the notarization stamp should be sulfate-based." She paused. Aldous Briggs had this document fabricated, probably within the last year, possibly within the last 6 months based on the ink oxidation. The kitchen went very quiet. Then a voice came from the doorway. Old, gravel deep. "She's right." Margaret turned. The man standing there was at least 60, weathered down to something that looked like it had been left out in the sun for a decade and then put back to work anyway. He had the eyes of someone who'd been waiting a long time for something to arrive without knowing what it was. "Ezra." Jesse's voice carried a warning. "Don't Ezra me." The old man walked in without being invited, which told Margaret everything she needed to know about how long he'd been on this ranch. He stopped in front of the deed and looked at it for a long time without touching it. "Your daddy filed with sulfate stamps. I was there. Rode with him to the county seat myself. 1861, August. He looked at Jesse. I told you Briggs was Snake. Told you 2 years ago. You told me you didn't trust his smile, Jesse said. That's not evidence. This is evidence. Margaret pulled a second document from her coat. This is a copy of the original filing from 1861, pulled from the State Archive in Austin. I sent for it 3 weeks ago when I first noticed the irregularity in the companion deed. She laid it beside the forged version. Compare the notarization stamps yourself. Jesse didn't move toward the table. He was looking at her the way she'd seen men look at her in courtrooms, that particular calculation, trying to figure out what angle she was working, what she wanted, what it was going to cost him. What's your interest in this? He said. I don't have an interest. I have information. Everybody who rides 4 days in bad weather to hand a man information has an interest. Fair point. She gave him that. I have a professional obligation, she said. I was hired by the county records office to audit land filings from the last 3 years. I found 14 irregularities across 7 ranches. Yours is the most urgent because Briggs has accelerated his timeline. You were sitting in that bank this morning. Whatever he put in front of you, if you sign it, you waive all claims to the eastern water corridor of this property. She held his gaze. That corridor connects to the Tanner Creek tributary. Whoever controls it controls water access for every small operation within 20 miles. I know what Tanner Creek is, Jesse said. I grew up on this land. Then you know what it's worth. And you know that without it, this ranch dies in the first dry summer. He walked to the table. Not fast. The walk of a man who didn't want to admit he was afraid of what he was going to see. He stood over the 2 documents for a long time. She watched him look at the notarization stamps. Watched him look again. Watched his hands close into fists at his sides, and then deliberately open. Who else knows about this? He said without turning around. Briggs's clerk, possibly. Whoever produced the forgery. The 14 ranchers he's already defrauded, though most of them don't know it yet. She paused. And now you. And now me. He turned around. And you expect me to do what exactly? Ride into town and accuse the county's most respected land agent of fraud based on ink chemistry and a woman I've never met who showed up bleeding on my table. I expect you to not sign anything until you've had a lawyer examine these documents. Nearest real lawyer is 60 miles east. I know, which is why I brought everything you'd need to file an immediate injunction with the circuit court. She reached into her coat a 3rd time and produced a bound set of papers. I drafted it myself. It's based on Statute 37 of the Texas Land Code of 1870, which allows a property owner to petition for a 30-day stay on any contested title transfer pending an independent examination. She set the papers on the table. You sign this instead of what Briggs brought you. It buys you time. Jesse Hargrove stared at the papers. Then he stared at her. Then he said, Who are you? I told you. You told me your name and your employment history. That's not the same thing. She could feel Ezra watching her from the doorway. She could feel the weight of the question the way she always felt it, like a hand pressed flat against her chest, waiting to see if she'd push back or crumple. I'm a woman who's good with documents, she said. And right now that's the only thing standing between you and losing this ranch by the end of the month. A new voice from outside, close to the kitchen window. Boss, you want me to send her off? Young, wary. The voice of someone who'd learned to be suspicious of strangers and hadn't yet learned when to stop. Back to work, Caleb, Jesse said. Footsteps moved away. Silence came back. You can't stay here, Jesse said. It wasn't harsh. It wasn't cruel. It was simply a fact being stated by someone who'd gotten used to stating facts without expecting them to change anything. I'm not asking to stay. I'm asking you to look at what I've brought you and decide whether it's real. She pulled out the small notebook she kept in her left coat pocket, the one she'd carried since her father died, the one that had outlasted 2 jobs, 1 husband, and 1 life she no longer recognized, and set it on top of the injunction papers. My working notes. Every document I examined. Every irregularity I found. Every date. Every name. Every cross-reference to the state archive. She stepped back. You don't have to trust me. You just have to read. Jesse picked up the notebook. He didn't open it. He just held it and looked at the cover like he was deciding something more complicated than whether to read it. Ezra crossed to the table. He picked up the original grant from 1861 and the forged deed and held them side by side near the window where the gray winter light came through strongest. He stood there for a long time. Long enough that nobody spoke. Long enough that Margaret started to hear the sounds of the ranch outside, men working animals, moving the wind, doing what wind does in West Texas in November, which is everything it wants. Jesse, Ezra said finally, I see it. Boy, I've been on this land since before you could walk. Your daddy showed me where every fence post went in. I watched him file that deed, the stamp on this one. He set them both down. Your daddy would have burned this himself if he'd lived to see it. Jesse was quiet for a moment. Then, when did Briggs start? Based on the documents I've examined approximately 18 months ago, Margaret said. He began with smaller operations. Ranchers who were already in debt, already vulnerable. Men who wouldn't have the resources to fight back, even if they understood what was happening. She kept her voice steady. This was the part that mattered most, and she'd learned to say it without letting her anger into her voice, because anger made men defensive, and defensive men stopped listening. Your ranch is different. You're not in critical debt. You have water. You have land that connects two grazing corridors. That makes you the most valuable piece of what he's assembling. She paused. And it makes you the most dangerous obstacle, which means he'll move faster. How fast? He filed the companion deed on Monday. He met with you this morning. If he follows the pattern I've documented, he'll file a second motion by end of week, claiming technical default on the title. That gives him legal standing to demand immediate transfer. She met his eyes. You have maybe 4 days. The muscle in Jesse Hargrove's jaw worked hard. She'd seen that expression before, not on him, but on men like him. Men who'd spent years being the one who held things together, the one who handled problems, the one everyone else looked to. Men who'd never needed help until the moment they needed it completely and didn't know how to ask. He opened the notebook. She waited. He read slowly. She could see his eyes moving down the lines, careful, thorough. Not skimming. That was something. A man who skimmed would have handed it back in 30 seconds and told her again to leave. A man reading carefully was a man beginning to believe what he was seeing. Ezra made coffee without asking anyone if they wanted it. Set a cup in front of Margaret without comment. She didn't thank him, just wrapped her uninjured hand around it and let the heat move through her fingers while she waited. After a long time, Jesse closed the notebook. He set it down. He put both hands flat on the table and looked at the surface between them and didn't speak for several seconds. You said 14 ranches, he said. 14 irregularities across 7 ranches. Some ranchers have already signed documents they shouldn't have signed. Some of those transfers may already be legally complicated to reverse. How many of them know what happened? None. Not yet. I was going to document everything first, then bring the complete case to the circuit court judge. She watched him. But your situation changed the timeline. Why mine specifically? She hesitated for a half second. Not long enough that most people would have noticed. Jesse Hargrove noticed. Because yours was the last one, she said. If Briggs completes your transfer, he'll have water access and land corridor sufficient to attract the Denver syndicate he's been negotiating with for the past 8 months. After that, the scale changes. Individual ranchers fighting a well-funded corporate entity through Texas courts is a different fight than 14 ranchers fighting one corrupt land agent. She held his gaze. If he gets your signature, the whole map changes. Jesse pushed off the table. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to her, which men always did when they were deciding something that was going to cost them something else. "You know what I used to do?" he said. It wasn't a question. She'd done enough research to know the answer, but she waited to see if he'd say it himself. 5 years as a deputy marshal out of Abilene. He didn't turn around. "You know why I'm not anymore. I know what the record says." "What does the record say?" "It says you discharged your weapon in the line of duty in March of 1873. The man you shot died. A subsequent inquest found that the identification provided to you by your supervising marshal was incorrect. The record leave out the part where a man's widow came to the courthouse and stood 20 feet from me in the hall." Silence. "The record leaves out a lot of things," he said. "Point being, I know what it looks like when someone's building a case. I know what it looks like when someone needs a rancher with a history in law enforcement to be the one who rides into town and points the finger." He turned around. "Makes a better story if the man who used to wear the badge is the one who brings it down." She hadn't expected that. She should have. She would remember later that she should have expected exactly that. "You think I'm using you?" she said. "I think 14 ranchers and 1 circuit court judge would make a cleaner case than 14 ranchers alone. And I think a former deputy marshal who's spent 4 years hating himself for one bad decision might be motivated to make a very public one in the opposite direction." His voice wasn't cruel. It was worse than cruel. It was accurate. "I'm not interested in being anyone's instrument, Miss Calloway. Not again." The room held still. Ezra looked at his coffee. Margaret set down her cup. She pulled on her coat. She picked up every document she'd brought except one she left the injunction papers on the table weighted down by the notebook. Then she walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame. "I lost my husband 4 years ago," she said. "Hoist accident at the mine outside Ellsworth. By the time I got there, there was nothing to identify him by except his belt buckle." She didn't look back. "I lost my daughter 2 years before that. Fever. She was 3 years old." She heard her own voice and noticed with some detached part of herself that it was still flat, still professional. Years of practice. "I have been in 14 counties in the last 3 years examining land records for a circuit court judge who pays me 30 cents per document and calls me his assistant instead of his clerk because assistant sounds less official and attracts less scrutiny." She paused. "I am not building anyone's case. I'm doing my job. And my job says that document on your table is forged, and you have 4 days." She stepped off the porch into the cold. Behind her, she heard Ezra's voice, low and dry as old wood. "Boy, sometimes the help that shows up bleeding ain't the enemy." She didn't hear Jesse's answer. She was already walking toward her horse hand, throbbing the cold hitting her face, the way it had been hitting her face for 4 days now, relentless and impersonal, the way West Texas weather always was, not cruel, not kind, just entirely indifferent to whether you made it through or didn't. She was checking her horse's left foreleg when she heard the kitchen door open again. She didn't turn around. Boots on frozen ground, steady pace, stopping about 6 feet behind her. "The injunction," Jesse said. "Walk me through how it works." She straightened up, turned around. His face was the same hard-guarded, carrying something he hadn't set down in a long time. But he was holding the notebook, and he was asking. She pulled her coat tighter against the wind. "You'll need to sign in front of a witness," she said. "Ezra can serve as witness if he's willing. Then we need to get it to the district filing office in Cutter's Creek before 5 o'clock Friday. From there it goes to Judge Abernethy's docket automatically, by virtue of the statute. And Briggs gets notified that a stay has been filed. He can't proceed with any title transfer until the examination is complete." "And then what?" "Then we build the full case, all 14 ranches, all forged documents, everything documented, dated, and cross-referenced to the state archive." She looked at him steadily. "Then we take Aldous Briggs apart so thoroughly that there won't be enough left of his reputation to hang a name on." Jesse was quiet for a moment. The wind moved between them. "You'll need somewhere to work," he said. "Records spread out. Space to organize. I can work from town. Briggs has 2 men on his payroll in town. One of them works at the hotel. He held out the notebook. You said 4 days. You can't afford to lose hours riding back and forth. His jaw tightened. There's a room off the back of the barn. Nothing fancy. But there's a stove and a table. Margaret looked at the notebook in his extended hand, then at his face. I'm not asking you to trust me, he said. I'm asking you to work fast. He paused. There's a difference. She took the notebook. I'll need access to your father's original filing records, she said. Whatever he kept here on the ranch. Ezra knows where everything is. Then let's start there. She put the notebook back in her coat. And Mr. Hargrove. Next time Aldous Briggs asks to meet with you, you say yes. You smile. You tell him you're still considering the documents. She held his gaze. You give him no reason to move faster than he already is. Jesse looked at her for a long moment. You really think we can stop him? I think the law is on your side if someone reads it correctly. She turned back toward the barn. That's what I do. She walked, and after a second she heard his boots following, and somewhere above them, the winter sky pressed down low and gray over Cutter's Creek, West Texas, indifferent as always, while 2 people who had both lost everything began without saying so to fight for the same piece of ground. Ezra kept his records in a wooden crate under a workbench at the back of the barn wrapped in oilcloth that had seen better decades but had done its job. He pulled it out without ceremony, set it on the bench, and stepped back like a man presenting evidence at trial. Everything William Hargrove ever filed, he said. Every deed, every tax payment, every water agreement, every bill of sale going back to 1858. The man kept paper the way other men kept cattle. Didn't trust anything that wasn't written down twice. Margaret lifted the oilcloth. The documents inside were dry, organized by year bound in thin cord. She picked up the top bundle and untied it without looking up. Did he keep copies of his correspondence with the county clerk's office? 3rd bundle from the bottom. He wrote to them every spring. Confirmation of filing. He didn't trust the postal service either. Smart man. She was already reading. Her hands moved through the pages with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 10,000 times, not scanning, not rushing, but processing at a speed that looked like rushing to anyone watching. Jesse stood in the doorway of the barn with his arms crossed, watching her the way a man watches something he doesn't fully understand, but is reluctantly impressed by. Caleb came in from the far end, carrying a saddle that needed stitching. He was 22 at most, with the kind of face that hadn't yet decided what kind of man it was going to settle into. He stopped when he saw Margaret at the workbench and looked at Jesse. Jesse gave him nothing, just a slight tilt of the head toward the door. Caleb set the saddle down and left. How many men does Briggs have working for him directly? Margaret asked without looking up. 2 that I know of, Jesse said. Luther Crane runs his errands. Mean as a stepped-on snake and about as smart. And there's a man named Denton who used to work surveys for the railroad. Briggs uses him for anything that requires someone to actually read a map. Denton is the one who produced the forgeries. She said it the way she'd say the sky is gray. Flat. Certain. The survey notations on the companion deed match a style I've seen in 2 other forged documents. Specific abbreviations. Specific way of rendering township coordinates. She pulled a page from the crate and held it next to something from her own notebook. Your father's original survey notation uses a different convention entirely. Regional difference. A man trained by the railroad would use the federal system. Jesse walked over. She moved slightly to give him room at the bench without making a production of it. He looked at the 2 pages side by side. I see it, he said. You have any idea how long Denton has been in the county? Showed up about 2 years ago, said he was retired from the railroad, bought a small place outside town. Jesse looked at the pages a moment longer. Nobody thought much of it. Nobody thinks much of anything until it's too late. That's how this works. She retied the bundle and set it aside. Briggs is patient. He's been doing this long enough to know that the best fraud is the one that looks like paperwork. People are afraid of paperwork. They don't read it carefully. They trust that the man sitting across the desk from them at the bank is operating in good faith. She reached for the next bundle. He counts on that. And the Denver Syndicate, Jesse said. You mentioned them last night. Who are they? A land consolidation company operating out of Colorado. They've been buying water corridor access across West Texas and New Mexico for 3 years. Not buying ranches directly that would attract attention. Buying the rights within ranches. Water rights. Grazing corridor rights. Access easements. She found what she was looking for and pulled it from the bundle. Once they own the rights, the land itself becomes worthless to the rancher. Can't water cattle without water rights. Can't move cattle without corridor access. The rancher sells for almost nothing. The syndicate picks up the land at distress prices and consolidates. And Briggs is their agent. He's their architect. There's a difference. She looked at him. An agent takes orders. An architect designs the system. Briggs designed this. The Denver men funded it. That's why he's been so careful. So methodical. He's protecting an investment that goes much higher than one county in West Texas. Jesse was quiet for a moment. Outside, 2 of the ranch hands were arguing about something near the water trough. Not angry, arguing the kind of bickering that meant things were normal. Ordinary. The sound of a ranch that didn't yet know how much danger it was standing in. You file that injunction Friday, he said, and Briggs knows someone's onto him. Yes. Which means he stops being methodical. Yes. She didn't soften it. He'll move to discredit the filing. Challenge my standing to submit it on your behalf. Possibly challenge my professional credentials. He may try to have the documents I pulled from the state archive declared improperly obtained. She set down the page she was holding. He'll also start looking for who I've spoken to, who helped me get the archive copies, whether I have backing from the circuit court or whether I'm operating independently. Are you operating independently? She paused for a half-second. Judge Abernethy knows I'm in the field. He doesn't know the scope of what I've found yet. She held Jesse's gaze. I sent him a preliminary report 2 weeks ago. I haven't had a response. Why not? Because Judge Abernethy is 64 years old, rides circuit through 4 counties, and his clerk is a 19-year-old boy who loses mail on a reliable basis. She said it without bitterness. Just fact. I've been in the field for 8 years. I've learned not to wait for responses. Jesse pulled a stool from under the bench and sat down. It was the first time he'd sat since she'd arrived. Something in the gesture said more than he probably intended, not surrender exactly, but the lowering of something he'd been holding up. You said you drafted the injunction yourself, he said. Yes. Based on Statute 37. Yes. You know Statute 37 because you've used it before. I used it once before in Comanche County, 1875. A widow named Priscilla Holt. Her husband had signed over his water rights 6 months before he died, supposedly voluntarily. He hadn't. The document had been produced under duress. I filed the injunction, the transfer was stayed, and the case went to circuit court. She turned back to the documents. Mrs. Holt kept her land. Jesse looked at her profile. She was already reading again, moving through the pages with that same focused efficiency, and he understood something he hadn't understood when she'd first walked in, that this wasn't performed competence. This wasn't a woman trying to convince anyone of anything. This was a woman who had done this so many times that the work itself had become the only thing she fully trusted. Priscilla Holt, he said. I know that name. Most people in West Texas know that name. She was one of the larger operations in Comanche County. She sent a letter to the Abilene Courier, after the case, said her clerk had saved her ranch. He paused, didn't mention the clerk's name. I asked her not to. Why? Margaret set down the pages, turned to face him fully. Because a woman who wins a land case against a powerful man in West Texas in 1875 has a choice. She can take credit for the win and spend the next 3 years being challenged, discredited, and driven out of every county where that powerful man has friends. She held his gaze. Or she can do her job, win the case, and move to the next county. Jesse was quiet for a moment. "How many cases?" he said. "How many what? How many cases have you won that nobody knows you won?" She picked the pages back up. "Enough to know how this works." Delia Cross appeared at the barn door with a pot wrapped in cloth and 2 tin cups. She was young and dark-haired and visibly pregnant, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone who'd been told to take it slow and was ignoring the advice. She set the pot on the near end of the bench. "Thought you might want coffee," she said. She looked at Margaret with direct, uncomplicated curiosity, not suspicious, not hostile, just genuinely interested. "I'm Delia. My husband Wade works the south fence line." Margaret Calloway. "I know. Ezra told me." Delia poured without being asked. "He also told me you rode 4 days in this weather." She handed Margaret a cup. "You eat anything today?" "I'll eat later." "That means no." Delia looked at Jesse. "She needs to eat." "She needs to work," Jesse said. "She can do both." Delia looked back at Margaret. "I'll bring something out. Don't argue with me, I'm nesting." She left before either of them could respond. Jesse watched her go with something that might have been the beginning of a smile if his face had been in the habit of completing them. "How far along is she?" Margaret asked. 6 months, maybe 7. Wade's scared to death. Tries not to show it." Margaret nodded once and went back to the documents. Jesse watched her for a moment. "You're not going to say anything sympathetic about that," he said. "Would it help Wade?" "No." "Then I'll save it." She pulled another bundle free. "What I need to know is who else on this ranch Briggs might have approached. Anyone who's needed money recently. Anyone with a grievance." Jesse's expression shifted. Slight, but she caught it. "Tell me," she said. "Caleb's family has a small property bordering my south line, about 80 acres. His father took sick last year. He borrowed against the land." Jesse's voice was careful. "From the Cutters Creek Bank, which Briggs has an arrangement with." "I didn't know that for certain until this morning." "Does Caleb know what his father borrowed against?" "I don't think so. His father didn't tell him the details." Margaret set down the bundle. "I need to see that document, whatever Caleb's father signed. Can you get it?" "I'd have to ask Caleb, which means explaining why I'm asking." "Then explain." "He's 22 years old. If I tell him his family's property is involved in a fraud scheme, he'll ride into town and do something that'll give Briggs exactly the excuse he needs to accelerate the timeline." "Then tell him enough to get the document without telling him enough to make him ride into town." She held Jesse's gaze. "You were a deputy marshal for 5 years. You know how to give a man information in measured portions." Jesse studied her. "You give orders like a woman who's used to men not following them." "I give information like a woman who's used to being the only person in the room who's read the relevant statutes." She turned back to the bench. "The orders are just suggestions based on the information." He almost smiled. Almost. He went to find Caleb. While he was gone, Ezra came back and stood at the far end of the bench without speaking for a while. Margaret worked. The barn settled around them, with the sounds barns make in the afternoon, animals shifting wind, finding the gaps in the boards, the particular silence of a place that has held years of hard work and hasn't forgotten any of them. "You remind me of someone," Ezra said finally. "Who?" "Jesse's mother. Rebecca Hargrove. She's been gone 12 years. He looked at the documents spread across the bench. "She used to sit at the kitchen table with papers spread out just like that. Bills, letters, accounts. William would handle the cattle and the land. Rebecca handled everything else." He paused. "She kept this ranch solvent through the drought of '67, by renegotiating every supply contract they had. William didn't know how to do it. Rebecca did. She just did it. Margaret kept working. What happened to her? Fever, same as takes most people out here. Ezra was quiet for a moment. Jessie was 26 when she died, already marshalling in Abilene by then. I don't think he ever fully understood what she'd done, how much of what he inherited worked because of her. He looked at Margaret. He'll figure it out. He doesn't need to figure out anything except whether to trust the legal strategy. That's not all he needs to figure out, Ezra said, and left it there. Jessie came back with Caleb behind him. Caleb was carrying a folded document with the careful hands of someone who'd been told it was important, but not why. He looked at Margaret with the wary expression he'd had every time he'd seen her, and a new layer of something else underneath it, worry poorly hidden. Mr. Hargrove says you need to look at something my daddy signed, Caleb said. Yes. She held out her hand. He gave her the document. She opened it and read it in silence. The barn waited. This isn't a standard loan agreement, she said. What is it? Caleb's voice had gone flat in the way young men's voices go flat when they're trying not to sound scared. It's a conditional conveyance. Your father borrowed $400 against the land and signed a clause that transfers the property automatically if the loan isn't paid in full by February 1st. She looked up. February 1st of this year. Caleb stopped. That's 3 months ago. Yes. The color left his face. Does that mean? It means Briggs already owns the legal claim to your family's property on paper. He hasn't acted on it yet because he's been waiting to complete the larger picture first. She set the document down. He was going to do it all at once. Take the smaller properties and the larger ones simultaneously so nobody had time to coordinate a response. Caleb's hands had closed into fists. Jessie stepped closer to him, not grabbing him, not restraining him, just placing himself near enough that the physical presence registered. Listen to me, Jessie said. You ride into town right now and you lose the land for certain. You stay here, you work with Miss Calloway, you follow her lead and there's a chance. My daddy doesn't know, Caleb said. He's still sick. He doesn't know it's all ready. Your father doesn't need to know yet, Margaret said. Her voice wasn't soft exactly, but it had lost the professional flatness for a moment. Just a moment. There's a legal remedy. It applies to your family's situation as well as Mr. Hargrove's. But it requires time, and it requires you to stay calm, and it requires you to trust that this is being handled. She held his eyes. Can you do that? Caleb looked at the document on the bench, then at Jessie, then back at Margaret. He was 22 years old and trying hard to be older and doing a reasonable job of it. Yes, ma'am, he said finally. Good. She picked up the document. I'm adding this to the filing. Briggs won't know we have it until it's already in front of the court. Caleb left. Jessie watched him go and then turned back to Margaret. The injunction covers his property too, he said. The statute allows for a consolidated filing when multiple properties are affected by the same fraudulent scheme. It's actually stronger than individual filings. It establishes a pattern rather than an isolated incident. She was already writing in her notebook. We have your property and Caleb's family's property documented. If there are others on this ranch in similar situations, I need to know by tomorrow morning. Jessie was quiet for a moment. Ezra, he said. Ezra, who had come back to the doorway without either of them noticing, said, I'll talk to the men tonight. The afternoon light was going flat and cold by the time Delia came back with bread and dried beef and something hot in a covered bowl that turned out to be bean soup. She set it on the clear end of the bench and looked at the documents spread across the rest of it and didn't comment, which told Margaret she was smarter than her cheerfulness suggested. Jessie sat on the stool again and ate standing over the bench, looking at the documents while he chewed. Margaret ate standing as well. Neither of them remarked on it. Tomorrow, Margaret said, you need to go about your normal business, ride your fences, be visible on the property. If Briggs has anyone watching and he does, they need to see nothing has changed. And you? I'll be working. She gestured at the crate. I haven't finished with your father's records yet, and I need to cross-reference the companion deed against the county tax rolls for the last 3 years. She paused. I'll need the tax rolls. Orville Nash keeps them. The sheriff. Deputy sheriff. Been here 30 years. Knew my father. Jessie looked at her. He's trustworthy. Is he brave? Jessie thought about it. He's honest. Brave is a different question. I'll need him to be both. She picked up her notebook. Can you arrange a meeting private? Not at his office. Tomorrow evening. I can bring him here. Good. She wrote something. One more thing. When Briggs contacts you, and he will contact you within the next 24 hours, asking about the documents he left with you, you tell him you're reviewing them with your own counsel. Don't tell him you have counsel here. Don't tell him anything has changed. Sound uncertain. Sound like a man who's considering his options. And if he pushes... She looked at him over the notebook. You spent 5 years as a deputy marshal, she said. You know how to lie to a man's face when you have to. Jessie held her gaze for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes that he didn't let reach his expression. Yeah, he said quietly. I know how to do that. She nodded and went back to work. Jessie stayed where he was for a moment longer than he needed to, looking at her bent over his father's documents in the fading light of the barn, and felt something he hadn't felt in 4 years. The particular unease of a situation moving faster than he'd anticipated, going somewhere he hadn't planned for, and finding he was less afraid of it than he should have been. He picked up his hat and walked out into the cold, and the barn settled back into silence, except for the scratch of Margaret's pen and the wind working at the boards. And somewhere outside Caleb's boots crossing the yard, carrying news his father didn't know yet, in a county that had no idea what was about to come down on it. Orville Nash arrived the next evening smelling like tobacco and wet wool, stomping mud off his boots on the porch before Jessie had finished opening the door. He was a thick man gone soft in the middle, with a lawman's eyes still working in a face that had given up on urgency some years back. He looked at Margaret sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread 3 layers deep and stopped in the doorway, the way men stopped when they encountered something they hadn't been adequately prepared for. Jessie said you needed to talk, he said. Sit down, Deputy Nash. He sat. Jessie pulled a chair from the wall and sat beside him, which Margaret noted was a deliberate choice beside not across, putting himself on Nash's level rather than at the head of the table. Former lawman knowing how to position himself in a room. She filed that away. I'm going to tell you something, and I need to know immediately whether you already know it, she said. Because if you already know it, and haven't acted on it, that's a different conversation than if this is news to you. Nash looked at Jessie. Jessie said nothing. Nash looked back at her. Go ahead. Aldous Briggs has been producing forged land documents for approximately 18 months. He has fraudulently transferred or attempted to transfer water rights and land access from at least 7 ranch operations in this county. He is working as an agent of a Denver-based land syndicate, and he has a corrupt arrangement with at least 1 officer of the Cutters Creek Bank. She paused. Did you know any part of that? Nash was quiet for a long time. His hands were flat on his knees, and he was looking at the table between them, and she watched the quality of his silence carefully, because there were different kinds of silence, and most of them told you something. I knew something was wrong, he said finally. Couldn't prove what. Couple of ranchers came to me last year saying their paperwork didn't look right. I sent a letter to the district attorney's office in Abilene. His jaw tightened. Got a letter back 3 months later saying the matter had been reviewed and no action was warranted. Who reviewed it? Letter just said the office. I want to see that letter. It's at my office. Tomorrow morning before 8 if you can manage it. She held his gaze. Deputy Nash, I need to ask you directly. Do you have any financial or professional relationship with Aldous Briggs? The color came up in his face. Not guilt. Offense. I do not. I'm not implying you do. I'm establishing for the record that you don't, because when this goes to court, Briggs's first offense will be to question the integrity of every person who acted against him. I need to know your answer before he asks the question. Nash breathed out through his nose. No relationship, financial or professional. I've had one drink with the man at the saloon 2 years ago at a town gathering. That's the sum of it. Good. She slid a document across the table to him. This is a consolidated injunction filing covering 2 properties in this county. I need it submitted to the district court filing office in Cutters Creek by 5 o'clock Friday. Submitted by you in your official capacity, accompanied by a sworn statement that the documents were obtained through proper legal procedure. Nash picked it up, read the first page, then the second. He read slowly, moving his lips slightly, which was not a sign of low intelligence, but of a man who'd learned to be careful about what he agreed to. Margaret waited. This is going to make Briggs move, Nash said. Yes. When he moves, I'm going to be standing in the middle of it. And I've got one deputy who's 19 years old and 2 years from useful. I know that. Then what do you expect me to do if Briggs decides the legal route is taking too long and sends Luther Crane to expedite things? I expect you to do your job, Margaret said. I expect you to enforce the law of this state as written. If Briggs sends Crane to intimidate witnesses or destroy documents, that's a criminal act, and you have full authority to respond to it. She leaned forward slightly. What I cannot do is build you courage, Deputy Nash. That part is yours. The silence was different this time, heavier. Jesse said, Orville, you sent that letter to the district attorney. That means you already chose a side. You just didn't have enough to make it matter. He looked at the older man steadily. Now there's enough. Nash set the document down, picked it up again, set it back down. I'll submit it Friday morning, he said, before 8. He left shortly after taking a copy of the filing and leaving behind the particular quiet of a man who'd just committed himself to something with real consequences. Margaret began reorganizing the papers on the table. Jesse stayed in his chair. You were hard on him, he said. I was honest with him. There's a difference. He's been a decent lawman for 30 years. I know, and being a decent lawman for 30 years in a quiet county is a completely different skill than going up against a man with a Denver syndicate behind him. She didn't look up from the papers. I needed to know if he understood what he was agreeing to. He does. She paused. He'll hold. Jesse watched her hands move through the documents. How do you know? Because he mentioned his 19-year-old deputy. She finally looked up. A man who was going to run wouldn't think about the deputy. He'd only think about himself. Nash thought about the boy. She held Jesse's gaze for a moment. He'll hold. Jesse didn't answer, but something shifted in the way he was sitting, slight as a change in wind direction, and about as easy to name. The next morning, Briggs sent a messenger. He arrived at the ranch house at 10 o'clock on a horse too good for a messenger, which told Margaret something before the man opened his mouth. He handed Jesse a sealed envelope and waited with the studied patience of someone who'd been told to wait for a response. Jesse opened it at the door. Read it. Passed it to Margaret, who was standing just inside the doorway, far enough back that the messenger couldn't see her clearly. The letter was brief and courteous, and beneath the courtesy was the unmistakable pressure of a man who expected compliance. Briggs expressed his hope that Mr. Hargrove had reviewed the documents thoroughly and looked forward to completing the transfer at his earliest convenience. He noted that the bank's schedule required confirmation by end of week. He wished Jesse good health and remained his sincere servant. Margaret read it twice. Tell him, she said quietly, that you appreciate his patience and you're working through the details with an advisor. Tell him you expect to have an answer by end of week. Use the word advisor, not lawyer, Not clerk. Advisor. It's vague enough to not alarm him, and specific enough that he'll spend time trying to figure out who you've brought in. Jesse looked at the messenger. Tell Mr. Briggs I appreciate his patience. I'm reviewing the documents with an advisor, and I'll be in touch by Friday. The messenger nodded and rode out. Jesse watched him go. Advisor? He repeated. He'll spend the next 24 hours making inquiries, trying to find out who rode into this ranch recently, who you've spoken to. She moved back to the table. That buys us time and occupies him simultaneously. What if he finds out about you specifically? He will find out about me specifically. The question is when. She sat down and picked up her pen. If he finds out before Friday, he moves to challenge the filing before it's submitted. If he finds out after Friday, the filing is already in the system and the challenge becomes harder. She wrote something in her notebook. So we need to make sure nothing unusual is visible from the road between now and Friday. No extra horses. No lights burning past midnight. No changes in routine. Ezra appeared in the kitchen doorway. Caleb's outside, says there's a problem. Margaret and Jesse both looked up. Caleb came in with his hat in his hands and his jaw set in the expression of someone delivering bad news he'd been rehearsing. Luther Crane was at the south fence line this morning, he said. Didn't come onto the property, just sat on his horse on the roadside and watched, for about an hour. Did he speak to anyone? Jesse asked. No, sir, just watched. Jesse looked at Margaret. He's establishing a presence, she said. Reminding you that you're being observed. It's a pressure tactic designed to make you feel watched, make you move faster, or make a mistake. She kept her voice even. Don't react. Don't send anyone to the fence line. Don't alter your schedule. Caleb's jaw tightened. He was watching my side of the fence specifically, the south corner that borders my daddy's land. I know. She held his eyes. I know it's hard. Stay calm. He left working hard at the calm she'd asked for, and mostly achieving it, which was more than most men twice his age would have managed. Jesse stood at the window with his back to her. Crane doesn't just watch, he said. I've heard things about him. I know what Luther Crane has done for Briggs, Margaret said. There are 2 other ranchers in the county who received intimidation visits after they asked questions about their documents. One of them found his water line cut. One of them had a barn fire. She paused. No evidence connecting Crane to either incident. Jesse turned around. His face had changed not dramatically, not into something unrecognizable, but the controlled, careful expression he'd been wearing since she arrived had thinned at the edges. Underneath it was something older and colder that she recognized from men who'd carried authority and lost it badly and never fully made peace with either. If he comes onto this property, Jesse said, then you handle it legally and document everything. Her voice was firm. Do you understand me? Everything that happens between now and Friday gets documented. Time description witnesses, everything, because the moment you respond physically to any provocation Briggs has grounds to claim you're an unstable party and challenge your standing to file. And if he doesn't wait for Friday, he'll wait. He's been building this for 18 months. He's not going to break his own pattern because one rancher asked for a few more days. She looked at him. He thinks he's already won. Men who think they've already won are patient. It's their greatest weakness. Jesse sat down slowly. He was quiet for a moment, his hands flat on his knees, and she could see him working through something, not the legal strategy, something older than that. In 1873, he said, the man I shot. His name was Daniel Coors. He was 31 years old. He wasn't looking at her. My supervising marshal gave me information that identified him as an armed robbery suspect. The identification was wrong. The marshal had a grudge against Coors's brother. His voice was steady in the way voices go steady when a story has been told internally so many times it's worn smooth. I didn't question the information. I had 4 years of experience and a marshal I trusted, and I didn't question the information. Margaret set down her pen. I have been very careful, Jesse said, since then about trusting information, about trusting people who bring me information and tell me the situation is urgent and ask me to act quickly. He finally looked at her. You understand why I'm telling you this? Yes. Then understand that everything you've shown me checks out. Every document, every cross-reference, everything I've been able to verify independently, it's real. I believe you. He held her gaze. That doesn't make trusting you easy. It just makes it possible. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Outside, she could hear the ranch going about its afternoon. Caleb's voice, somewhere a horse objecting to something, the ordinary sounds of a place still functioning normally while something tried to devour it from underneath. The man who died, she said carefully. His widow. Did she ever speak to you directly? No. Do you know what became of her? Moved to her sister's family in Oklahoma. Took her 2 children. He looked at his hands. I found that out later. I wasn't looking for it. Someone just told me. She picked up her pen. Not to write anything, just to have something in her hand. My husband worked the mines because it paid better than anything else available to a man with no formal education and 3 people depending on him. He understood it was dangerous. He went anyway. She looked at the papers on the table. After he died, I spent 6 months being angry at him for choosing the work that killed him. 6 months being angry at a dead man. She paused. Then I started reading law because reading gave me something to do with my hands, and law gave me something to do with the anger. Jesse was very still. The guilt doesn't go away, she said. But it can become something that makes you more careful instead of something that makes you stop. She met his eyes. You didn't stop. You came back to this ranch and you've been running it for 4 years and you've been trying. She picked up the injunction draft. That's not nothing, Mr. Hargrove. The kitchen held them both for a moment in the specific silence of 2 people who have said more than they planned to and are deciding together whether that was a mistake. Then Delia appeared in the doorway, breathless and wide-eyed, with the look of a woman who's carrying news she ran to deliver. Jesse, there's a rider on the North Road, coming fast. She caught her breath. It's not Crane. It's a boy. Maybe 16. He's riding like something's on fire. Jesse was out the door before she finished the sentence. Margaret capped her pen and followed. The boy's name was Henry Pratt, and he worked at the county records office, sweeping floors and running errands and trying to save enough to buy his mother medicine, and he was 16 years old, and he had just ridden 6 miles in under an hour because he'd seen something that morning that he couldn't unknow. He got down from his horse and stood in front of Jesse and Margaret with his chest heaving and his eyes wide with the particular expression of young people who have just discovered that the adult world is considerably more dangerous than advertised. Mr. Briggs came in this morning, he said. Early. Before Mr. Carey got in. I was sweeping the back room. He swallowed. He went to the filing cabinet, the one with the current deed transfers. He took something out and put something in. He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. I took this out before he put the new one in. I know I shouldn't have. I know that's probably illegal. But it didn't feel right, and Miss Calloway. He looked at Margaret. People say you're the one who figures out when things aren't right. Margaret took the paper from his hands. She unfolded it and read it. She read it again. The morning air was cold and still around them, and Jesse watched her face go through something that wasn't quite alarm, but was close to it, the expression of a person encountering something worse than what they'd prepared for. What is it? Jesse said. She looked up. He's not waiting until Friday. She turned to the boy. What time did he come into the office this morning? Just past 7. She looked at Jesse. He filed an emergency motion this morning claiming technical default on your title. He's backdated a payment demand that he claims was delivered to you 30 days ago. She held up the original document. This is the copy he wanted to replace, the one without the backdated demand attached. Her voice had gone completely flat. He knows someone is looking at his documents. He's accelerating. Jesse's hands had gone still at his sides. "He's trying to beat the injunction," she said. "If the emergency motion is accepted before our filing reaches the system Friday, he can claim the transfer is already legally initiated and our injunction applies to a completed transaction rather than a pending one." She looked at him directly. "We can't wait until Friday." "When?" "Tomorrow morning. First thing. Before the records office opens if possible." She was already moving toward the house. "I need to rework the filing tonight. Add the emergency motion as evidence of fraud in progress. That actually strengthens our case significantly. He's just handed us proof that he modifies documents when he feels threatened." She stopped and turned back. "Henry." The boy looked at her. "You did the right thing," she said. "Go home. Don't go back to that office until you hear from me. Don't speak to Briggs if he comes looking for you." She held his eyes. "Can you do that?" Henry Pratt stood up a little straighter in the way 16-year-olds do when someone treats them like their decision matters. "Yes, ma'am." "Good." She looked at Jesse. "I need 3 hours and all the lamplight you can spare." Jesse turned to Ezra, who had materialized on the porch in the way Ezra materialized places quietly without fanfare, already knowing what was needed. "Bring every lamp in the house to the kitchen table," Jesse said. "Already moving," Ezra said. Margaret took the steps 2 at a time and was at the table before the first lamp arrived. The original document spread flat before her, her pen already in her hand, building the case that had just grown larger and more dangerous and considerably more urgent than it had been an hour ago, while outside, the last of the afternoon light died over Cutter's Creek, and somewhere in town, Aldous Briggs sat in his office, believing he was still the only one who understood how the game was played. He was wrong. But he didn't know that yet. Margaret worked through the night. Not the romantic version of working through the night that people described later when they told the story, not bent gracefully over candlelight, with her hair loose and her expression serene. She worked the way she always worked when time was compressing, and the stakes were real fast, and ugly, and fueled by cold coffee, and the particular stubbornness that had gotten her through 8 years of counties that didn't want her there. Jesse stayed up with her. He didn't pretend he was doing it to help with the documents, because they both knew the documents were hers, and she didn't need him reading over her shoulder. He stayed because the house felt different with someone working in it, because the lamps were lit, and there were papers on the table, and for the first time in 4 years the kitchen wasn't just the room where he made coffee and tried not to remember things. He made coffee, set a cup near her elbow without comment. She drank it without looking up. Around midnight she said without stopping writing, "Tell me about the water corridor, the eastern one Briggs wants. Tell me its practical value, not the legal description, what it actually means for this ranch." Jesse pulled his chair closer to the table. "Tanner Creek runs east to west across the northern quarter of my land. In a dry year, and we get dry years every 3 or 4, it's the only reliable water source for cattle grazing the South Range. Without access to that corridor to move the herd north when the south tanks dry up, I lose cattle." He paused. "Not some cattle, most of them. And the neighboring ranches, smaller operations. 3 families between here and the Ridley spread to the east. Dawson Pratt Henry's family and an older widow named Cecilia Marsh who runs about 40 head on her own. They all have historic access to that corridor, verbal agreements with my father going back to the 60s. He watched her hand move across the page. "Not written, which means legally unenforceable if the corridor changes ownership, which means they lose their cattle in the first bad summer and sell their land for whatever anyone offers." He leaned forward. "Which is exactly what Briggs needs. Once the small operations fail, the Denver Syndicate can assemble the full corridor from my eastern boundary to the Ridley spread without anyone left to object." Margaret stopped writing. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, not with exhaustion, but with the expression of someone adding a final column of numbers and arriving at a sum they'd suspected but hadn't confirmed until now. "He isn't building a land portfolio," she said. He's building a water monopoly. She looked at Jesse. The Denver Syndicate doesn't want ranches. They want to control water access for the entire South Range Basin. Every rancher in this county would eventually pay them for access to water their families homesteaded 30 years ago. She picked her pen back up. I need to add the Dawson, Pratt, and Marsh properties to the consolidated filing. You can do that without their signatures. Under the statute, I can file on behalf of parties who can demonstrate they are materially affected by the same fraudulent scheme. Their historic access rights constitute material interest. She was already writing. I'll need Ezra to testify to the verbal agreements with your father. His tenure on this ranch makes him a credible witness to the historic arrangement. Ezra will testify to anything that's true, Jesse said. That's never been the question with him. She wrote for another hour. Jesse watched the fire and didn't sleep and didn't pretend to, and somewhere around 2 in the morning, in the particular honesty that arrives when people are tired enough to stop managing themselves carefully, he said, My wife's name was Alice. Margaret's pen slowed, didn't stop. She died 4 years ago, March. The birth took 36 hours, and at the end of it, there was nothing the doctor could do, and nothing I could do, and nothing anyone could do. His voice was the same voice he'd used for everything else level, contained the voice of a man who'd processed the same information so many times he'd worn the edges off it. The baby was a boy. He didn't survive either. Margaret set down her pen. I was in the next room, Jesse said. I'd been a deputy marshal for 5 years. I'd dealt with violence and crisis and situations that required me to act and think simultaneously, under conditions that would break most men. He paused, and I stood in the next room, and I couldn't do a single useful thing. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the fire. After that, he said, I couldn't be a marshal anymore. Couldn't carry the authority. Couldn't stand in front of someone and represent the idea that the law protected people, that doing your job correctly meant people didn't get hurt. He shook his head slightly. I came back here. This was what was left. And you've been running it alone for 4 years. The men run most of it. Ezra runs what the men don't. He looked at her. I've been present. I'm not sure that's the same as running it. She held his gaze for a moment. It's more than you're giving yourself credit for. You don't know that. I know your men haven't left. I know Caleb Pratt, who could work anywhere, is still here. I know Ezra, who is old enough and competent enough to have moved on years ago, is still here. She picked her pen back up. Men don't stay for land. They stay for something worth staying for. Jesse was quiet for a long time. Your daughter, he said carefully. What was her name? Clara. The word came out without hesitation, which surprised her. She'd learned over 2 years to hesitate before that name, to feel it coming and brace for it. This time it came straight out clean. She had brown hair and she was afraid of dogs, and she laughed at everything. She laughed the way children laugh before they learn that some things aren't funny. Her voice didn't break. It just went quieter. She'd been sick twice before and recovered both times. The third time, I was certain she'd recover again. I was absolutely certain. And you've blamed yourself for being certain. She looked at him. I've blamed myself for a great many things. For being in Ellsworth when she died. For being in Ellsworth at all. She didn't answer, which was its own answer. You said your husband worked the mines. You were working too. Somebody had to be in Ellsworth. She was with a neighbor woman, a good woman. She did everything right. Margaret set her pen down again. That's the part that's hardest to carry. That everyone did everything right and it still happened. There's nothing to correct, nothing to fix, no document to examine, and no error to identify, and no remedy to file. She looked at the papers in front of her. I'm very good at finding errors. I'm very good at identifying what went wrong and establishing what should have happened instead. Her hands were still on the table. I had nothing to do with that. Jesse reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not squeezing, not performing comfort, just placing the weight of his hand over hers and leaving it there. She looked at it for a moment. Then she turned her hand over, and his fingers closed around hers, and they sat like that for a little while without either of them saying anything else, and the fire worked down, and the lamps burned steady. And outside West Texas did what it always did at 3 in the morning in November, which was stay cold and dark and entirely indifferent, and neither of them minded that at all. She finished the filing at 4:30 in the morning. She set down her pen and flexed her right hand, the injured one, the one that had been stiff since the fence rail, and looked at the stack of documents in front of her with the expression Jessie had seen on her face when she was calculating something and arriving at a result she trusted. "It's solid," she said. "It's as solid as I know how to make it." She looked at him. "It covers your property, Caleb's family's land, the Dawson operation, the Pratt homestead, and the Marsh property. It presents Briggs's emergency motion as evidence of fraud in progress rather than legitimate legal action. It includes Henry's testimony that Briggs modified county records, which is a criminal act independent of the civil fraud." She picked up the stack and aligned the edges. "If Judge Abernethy's court receives this and acts on it, Briggs loses his legal standing in this county permanently. And if they don't act on it, they will act on it. This is too well documented to ignore." She set the stack down. "But I want to be honest with you, even when courts act correctly, they act slowly. This injunction buys you time. It protects the property from immediate transfer. The full case, the criminal referral, the recovery of what Briggs has already taken from other ranchers, that takes longer. How much longer? Months, possibly a year." She met his eyes. "I won't lie to you about the timeline." He shook his head slightly. "You haven't lied to me about anything." "No, I haven't." They looked at each other across the table with its spread of papers and empty coffee cups, and something settled between them that was different from everything that had come before. Not tentative anymore. Not two people deciding whether to trust each other, but something that had already decided and was simply acknowledging the fact. Ezra knocked at the kitchen door at 5:30, which meant he'd been awake for at least an hour, which meant he'd probably been awake most of the night. He looked at the documents on the table, and at Jessie, and at Margaret, and at the empty coffee pot, and said without inflection, "I'll make more coffee." "We need to ride to town by 7, Margaret said. "Nash is meeting us at the filing office." "I'll have the horses ready at 6:30. Ezra poured water into the pot. "Caleb's up. He wants to come." Jessie looked at Margaret. "He has standing in this filing," she said. "His presence is appropriate." She paused. "Keep him calm." "I'll talk to him," Jessie said. He found Caleb in the barn checking his saddle with the focused energy of a young man who hadn't slept and didn't want to admit it. Caleb looked up when Jessie came in and went straight to it the way he always did without preamble. "Is it going to work?" he said. "Miss Calloway built the best case I've ever seen, and I spent 5 years watching men build cases." Jessie leaned against the stall door. "It's going to work. And my daddy's land is in the filing, same as mine." He held Caleb's gaze. "You kept your head these past 3 days. That matters. When we get to town, it still matters. Whatever Briggs does, whatever Crane does, whatever happens in that filing office, you keep your head." Caleb's jaw was tight. "Yes, sir." "One more thing." Jessie waited until the younger man met his eyes fully. "Your father's going to be all right. And when this is over, you're going to tell him what you did. That you stayed calm when it was hard, and you trusted the process, and you protected his land." He paused. "That's worth telling." Caleb looked down at his saddle. When he looked back up, his jaw wasn't quite as tight. "Yes, sir," he said again. But different this time. They rode into Cutter's Creek at 7:15, 4 of them. Jessie, Margaret, Caleb, and Ezra, who had declared himself present without anyone asking, and nobody had thought to argue. The town was doing its early morning business, the kind of business that happened before the official day started deliveries chores, the movement of people who worked before the world was watching. Nash was waiting outside the filing office with the copy of the injunction he'd been given the night before and the expression of a man who'd slept badly and made peace with it. He looked at the documents Margaret carried and nodded once. "Carrie opens at 7:30, he said. "He's inside already. I can see his lamp." "When we go in," Margaret said, "I present the consolidated filing. You present your sworn statement. You speak to the official capacity of the submission that it was obtained through proper legal procedure and submitted by the county's law enforcement authority." She looked at him. "I'll handle the legal explanation. And if Carrie questions your standing to have drafted it, then I'll provide my professional credentials and reference Judge Abernethy's circuit authorization for independent examination of county land records." She held up a document. "I have it in writing." Nash looked at Jesse. Jesse looked back at him. The look said everything that needed saying, that they were here, that they were doing this, that the moment had arrived after all the preparation, and the long nights, and the accumulated evidence, and there was nothing left to do except walk through the door. "All right," Nash said. "Let's go." The filing office was small and warm and smelled like paper and ink, the way all places that handled documents smelled, which was the smell Margaret had grown up around in her father's accounting rooms, and which still meant, despite everything, something close to safety. The clerk, Carey, was a thin man in his 50s, with careful hands, and the demeanor of someone who'd spent 30 years being the last line of defense between chaos and the official record. He looked at the group of 4 people who walked into his office, and then at the stack of documents Margaret set on his counter, and then at Nash's badge, and then back at the documents. "Deputy Nash," he said carefully. "Morning, Carey. We're submitting a consolidated injunction filing under Statute 37 of the Texas Land Code, multi-property fraud related." Nash kept his voice the voice of routine, official, unremarkable. "Miss Calloway is the filing attorney of record. I'm here in official capacity per the submission requirement." Carey looked at Margaret. "You're the clerk Judge Abernethy uses for land examinations." "Yes." She set her credentials on the counter beside the filing. "You may verify them." He read them. He read the top 3 pages of the filing. He looked at the evidence attachments. He was quiet for a long enough time that Caleb shifted his weight behind Margaret, and Jesse put a hand on Caleb's arm without looking at him, and the hand said, "Hold." "This name's Aldous Briggs," Carey said. "Yes." "This is going to cause considerable disruption." "Considerable disruption to a fraud scheme," Nash said. "Yes." Carey looked at him, looked at the documents again, set them down, picked up his stamp. The sound of the official seal hitting the filing document was small and mechanical and entirely ordinary, the sound of 1,000 routine transactions in 1,000 county offices across the state. But in that particular office, at that particular moment, it was the loudest thing Margaret had heard in years, because it meant the filing was real. It was in the system, it existed in the official record, in a way that nothing could unmake without leaving traces. She let out a breath so carefully that nobody could have heard it. "Copies to Judge Abernethy's docket by end of day," she said to Carey. "Standard procedure," he said. "You'll receive confirmation by return post within 72 hours. She gathered the receipt and the filed copy and turned to face the 3 men behind her. Jesse was watching her with the same expression she'd seen in the barn when she'd first shown him the comparative stamps, not quite relief, something more complicated than relief, the expression of a man reassessing something fundamental about the world he was living in. They were outside on the street when Luther Crane found them. He came from the alley beside the general store, which meant he'd been waiting, not coincidentally passing, not happening to be in the area, but specifically positioned and specifically waiting. He was a large man who used his size the way some men used money, as an argument that preceded any other. He stopped 15 feet away and looked at the group with the assessing eyes of someone running numbers. His gaze went to Margaret, stayed there. "You'd be the woman from the barn," he said. I'd be the attorney of record on a consolidated fraud injunction that was filed 8 minutes ago, she said. Which means any action you take against me or any party present constitutes obstruction of a legal proceeding. That's a felony under Texas statute. She held his gaze. Deputy Nash has jurisdiction and a badge. Would you like to continue this conversation? Crane's jaw worked. He looked at Jesse. Jesse looked back at him with the cold, flat stillness of a former deputy marshal who had made peace, or at least an armistice, with the fact that he knew how to inhabit that particular silence, and probably always would. He didn't reach for the gun at his hip. He didn't need to. Some stillness was its own message. Tell Briggs the filing is in the system, Jesse said. Tell him he's welcome to challenge it in court. Tell him we'll be ready. Crane stood there for another moment. Then he walked back the way he'd come, which was not the behavior of a man who'd been given instructions to escalate, and Margaret noted that with something that was not quite satisfaction, but was in the same neighborhood. Ezra said from the back of the group, "That went better than expected." "Don't say that," Margaret said. "Why not?" "Because every time someone says something went better than expected, the next thing that happens goes considerably worse." Ezra considered this. Fair point. They were halfway back to the horses when Jesse fell into step beside her, close enough that his arm was almost touching hers in the narrow space of the boardwalk. "Nash is going to send for the circuit judge today," he said. "He should. The sooner Abernethy has eyes on this, the harder it becomes for Briggs to move laterally through the system. And Briggs himself. What does he do now?" She thought about it for half a block. He has two options. He accepts that he's been caught and begins the process of damage control, which means implicating the Denver syndicate and hoping they don't decide to cut their losses by cutting him instead. She paused. Or he decides the only way out is through, and he moves against the people who filed. Against you. Against the filing. Against the witnesses. Against anyone whose testimony supports the case. She looked at the street ahead of them. Henry Pratt is the most vulnerable. He's young, his family has land in the filing, and Briggs knows he took that document. "I'll send someone to his family tonight." She looked at him. "You'd do that." "I'd do that." He said it without performance, the way he said most things as a plain fact with no requirement for acknowledgement. "This started as your fight. Somehow it became ours." He paused. "I don't know exactly when that happened." She thought about saying something careful, something professional and measured and appropriately bounded. She thought about it, and then she didn't do it. "I think it happened in the barn," she said, "when you asked me to walk you through how the injunction worked." She kept her eyes on the street. "That's when I knew you weren't going to be someone who took what I offered and then found a reason to dismiss it. That's a low bar. You'd be surprised how many men don't clear it." He was quiet for a moment. "Miss Calloway." "Margaret." He let that settle. "Margaret." He said it once like he was deciding whether it fit, and apparently decided it did. "When this is over, and it's not over, I'm not saying it's over, but when it is, I'd like you to stay." She kept walking. "Stay." "At the ranch. There's legitimate work, the documents for the other affected ranchers, the tax recovery process, the water rights documentation for the historic agreements. Months of work done properly." He paused. "And not just work." She didn't look at him. The street went past them, and behind them, Ezra and Caleb and Nash talked about something she wasn't hearing, and the morning light of Cutter's Creek went about its ordinary business. "I don't know how to stay," she said. "I've told you that." "I know you have." "I mean it seriously. It isn't modesty. I've been moving for 6 years, and I don't know if the ability to stay is something that's still in me." "I don't know either." He said it with the honesty she'd come to understand was simply how he operated. "But I know that 3 days ago I was a man sitting alone in a kitchen watching everything my family built disappear into forged paperwork, and I couldn't see any way through it." He paused. "Now I can see the way through. and you're standing in it." She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. She looked at him in the morning light of Cutter's Creek, this man who'd lost his wife and his child, and his faith in his own judgment, and had come back to his father's land, and stayed, because staying was the only honest thing he knew how to do anymore. This stubborn, careful, honest man, who'd handed her a notebook full of his father's records and said, "I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to work fast," and who had somehow in 3 days become someone she could not imagine having done this without. "Ask me again," she said, "when it's over." "I will," he said. He meant it. She knew he meant it the way she knew document fraud, not from hope, but from evidence accumulated and cross-referenced, and solid enough to stand on. They walked back to their horses and rode out of Cutter's Creek, and behind them, the filing office held its stamped copy of a consolidated injunction that was about to change everything, and ahead of them, the ranch waited with its loyal men and its winter bare fields and its long, complicated future, and neither of them spoke much on the ride back because some things didn't need words yet, and both of them were wise enough to know it. Aldous Briggs moved faster than Margaret had predicted, which meant she'd underestimated him, which was a mistake she catalogued and filed away in the part of her mind that kept track of errors so she wouldn't repeat them. By noon on the day of the filing, he'd sent a formal letter to the district court, challenging her professional standing to submit documents on behalf of multiple parties without individual signed authorization from each property owner. By 2 o'clock, he'd dispatched Luther Crane to the Pratt homestead, not to threaten, not openly, but to speak with Henry's father about outstanding obligations on their loan, which was a message dressed in the clothes of routine business and was therefore harder to name and harder to stop. Jesse had already sent Caleb to the Pratt homestead that morning, as he'd said he would. Caleb arrived an hour before Crane. He sat with Henry's father and explained in the careful, measured way he'd learned watching Margaret work what the filing meant and what Crane's visit would mean and what the family needed to do, which was nothing. Say nothing, sign nothing, and send Crane away with the information that their legal interests were currently represented in an active court proceeding. When Crane arrived and found a composed family, a copy of the injunction receipt on the kitchen table, and Caleb Pratt sitting in a chair by the door, with the quiet readiness of a young man who'd been told to keep his head and was doing exactly that, he left without saying much. Which was its own kind of victory, small and unglamorous, and necessary. Margaret heard about it when Caleb came back to the ranch that evening and reported it the way she'd trained all of them to report things fact sequence. Observable behavior, no interpretation until the facts were complete. "You did well," she said. Caleb nodded once, the nod of someone receiving a grade they'd worked for. "Henry's father wants to know if you'll come speak with him." "Tomorrow morning. I'll ride over." She looked at her notes. "I need his signature on a supplemental authorization to formalize his inclusion in the filing. I should have obtained it before submission, but the timeline didn't allow it." She paused. "It doesn't invalidate the filing. It strengthens it." Jesse was at the table across from her with the ranch's account ledger open, which had become the shape of their evenings, her on the documents, him on the accounts, the two of them working in the same space, in a silence that had gone from cautious to comfortable, without either of them marking the exact moment of transition. Ezra moved in and out. Delia brought food. The ranch breathed around them. "Briggs's challenge to your standing," Jesse said, without looking up from the ledger. "How serious is it?" "Moderately serious. He's correct that individual authorization is cleaner, but the statute permits emergency consolidated filing when individual authorization cannot be obtained within the timeline required to prevent harm." She set down her pen. "I have Judge Abernethy's circuit authorization for land examination, which establishes my professional standing. The question is whether the district court accepts that as sufficient basis for the consolidated submission. And if they don't, then the filing gets kicked back for individual reauthorization, and we lose approximately 2 weeks while Briggs uses that window to complicate the picture further." She looked at him. "Which is why I need a response from Abernethy. Today, if possible." Jesse closed the ledger. I can ride to the telegraph office first thing tomorrow. I need to go myself. The response needs to come to me directly to establish the chain of authorization. She started reorganizing her papers. I'll go in the morning. Get Henry's father's signature on the way back. I'm going with you. She looked up. He said it the way he said things that weren't open for debate, not harshly, just as a fact already decided. Crane made a point of knowing who you are and where you've been, he said. Until this is further along, you don't ride alone. She considered objecting. She'd been riding alone for 6 years, and she'd managed adequately. But she thought about what adequately had cost her the fence rail the 4 days in bad weather, the accumulated years of handling everything herself because there was nobody else available, and she recognized that adequately was not the same as well, and that there was someone available now. Fine, she said. He almost smiled. They were in the telegraph office in Cutter's Creek by 7:30 the next morning. The operator, a thin young man with ink-stained fingers, took Margaret's outgoing message for Judge Abernethy and promised a response within 4 hours if the judge was accessible on the Abilene line. They waited at the hotel across the street, which was not the hotel where Briggs's contact worked. Jessie had noted that detail when Margaret first mentioned it and had chosen accordingly. The hotel dining room was quiet at that hour. They drank coffee and ate eggs and didn't talk about Briggs or the filing or the Denver syndicate, because there was nothing more to do about any of it until Abernethy responded, and they both understood that instinctively without discussing it. What did your father's ranch look like when he started? Margaret asked. Jessie looked up. Small, about 200 acres, one structure, no barn. He used to tell a story about the first winter he and my mother slept in the same room as the horses because there wasn't enough firewood to heat 2 spaces. He built it up from that. Over 20 years, slowly. Every drought year knocked it back. Every good year pushed it forward. He looked at his coffee cup. He used to say the land didn't care about your plans. It was indifferent. You adapted or you didn't. Sounds like my father talking about numbers. She turned her cup in her hands. He used to say the books don't lie, but the people do, which meant if the numbers were wrong, you didn't argue with the numbers, you found the person. He was right about that. He was right about a lot of things before the whiskey got to most of them. She said it without self-pity, the way people referred to facts they'd made their peace with years ago. He taught me to find the error in a column of numbers the way some fathers teach their sons to find water in dry country, as a survival skill. She paused. I used to think that was a sad way to raise a child. And now, she considered. Now I think every skill that keeps you alive was worth learning, regardless of the circumstances that made it necessary. Jessie was quiet for a moment. Clara, he said. Just the name, careful as a placed step. What would she have been like if you'd had more time? The question surprised her, not because it was inappropriate, it wasn't, but because in 6 years nobody had asked her that. People said they were sorry. People said they understood. Nobody had ever asked her to look forward instead of back at it. She set down her cup. Stubborn, she said. She was already stubborn at 3. She had opinions about everything, and she stated them without apology. She paused. She would have been the kind of woman who walked into a stranger's kitchen with a bleeding hand and told him his deed was forged. Jessie looked at her across the table. She would have been remarkable, Margaret said. The word came out steady. It cost her something to say it steadily, and she paid it without resentment, because Clara was worth the cost. She would have been absolutely remarkable. Jessie put his hand on the table, palm up. An offering, not a demand. She looked at it for a moment, and then she put her hand in his, and they stayed that way, while the dining room went about its quiet morning business. 2 people sitting with their losses laid out between them like maps, finding that when you set them side by side, they didn't diminish each other, but made a kind of terrible, honest sense. The telegraph response came in 2 hours and 40 minutes. Margaret read it at the counter, then read it again, then folded it and put it in her coat with the particular deliberateness of someone securing something valuable. "Abernethy confirms circuit authorization," she said to Jesse. "He's routing the filing through his direct docket rather than the standard district court queue. That bypasses the challenge to my standing entirely if it's on his docket. His authorization covers the submission method." She paused. "He also says he's received complaints about Cutter's Creek land transactions from 2 other counties. He's been building a case of his own." Jesse looked at her. He already knew. He knew something. He didn't have documentation. She looked at the folded telegraph. "We just gave him the documentation." They were back at the ranch by noon. They were on the road past the Pratt homestead, almost to the ranch's north fence, when they heard the horse coming hard from behind them, and turned to find Nash riding fast, with his face set in a way that didn't suggest good news. He pulled up alongside them, breathing hard. "Briggs is at the county clerk's office right now. He brought a lawyer up from San Angelo. They're trying to file a counter motion claiming the injunction was obtained through improper procedure." He looked at Margaret. "They're specifically naming you, saying you misrepresented your credentials to the court." "They're wrong," she said. "I have Abernethy's telegraph confirmation in my coat." "I know that. But if they get the counter motion into the record before I can present the confirmation, they create a procedural delay that—" "How long ago did they arrive?" 20 minutes. Carey sent his boy to find me. I came straight here." Margaret looked at Jesse. He was already turning his horse. They rode back into town the way Crane had watched them from the south fence, fast visible and entirely certain of where they were going. The county clerk's office was the loudest it had probably been in its entire institutional existence. Briggs was there in person, which Margaret noted as significant. He was rattled enough to come himself rather than work through intermediaries. The San Angelo lawyer, a man named Whitfield, with a city suit and the careful grooming of someone who charged by the hour, was presenting papers to a visibly distressed Carey, while Luther Crane stood against the wall, providing the unspoken argument of his considerable physical presence. They stopped when Jesse walked in. Margaret a step behind him. Nash behind her. The room had a specific quality of stillness that Margaret recognized from courtrooms, the moment before something is decided, when everyone present understands that whatever happens next is going to matter. Briggs looked at Margaret with the expression of a man who'd spent 18 months being the most prepared person in every room he entered, encountering for the first time someone who'd done more preparation than him. It was a specific expression. She'd seen it before. She'd been working toward it for 3 days. "Miss Calloway," he said. His voice was composed, professionally composed, which was different from genuinely composed. "I believe your filing contains some procedural irregularities that we should discuss. I believe your land documents contain some forgeries that the circuit court is currently discussing," she said. "But we can address your procedural concerns first if you prefer." She reached into her coat. "Judge Abernethy's direct authorization of my filing received by telegraph this morning routed through his personal docket." She set it on Carey's counter. "Your counter motion challenges my standing under the standard district court submission procedure. That procedure no longer applies. The filing is on Abernethy's docket directly." Whitfield picked up the telegraph confirmation, read it. His expression did something careful and controlled that was still, if you were watching closely, the expression of a man whose central argument had just been removed from under him. "The authorization language is broad," Whitfield said. "It's the language Judge Abernethy used. If you'd like to challenge his authorization of his own docket, you're welcome to take that up with him directly." Margaret held the lawyer's gaze. "He's expecting correspondence. He told me so in the telegram." Briggs was looking at her now with the look he'd been keeping controlled since she walked in. Not anger exactly, something more dangerous than anger. The look of a man whose careful system was coming apart, and who was deciding in real time whether to cut his losses or try to salvage the architecture. She'd seen men make that calculation before. She'd learned to read the moment when the calculation completed. She watched it complete in Aldous Briggs' face. "Crane," he said. His voice had changed. The professional composure was gone. What replaced it was quieter and colder, and considerably more honest about what he actually was. "Time to go." Crane pushed off the wall. Nash stepped between Crane and the door. He was shorter than Crane and older and softer around the middle, and he put himself in the space anyway, with the steady, unhurried placement of a man who'd decided which side of the line he was on and wasn't going to unchoose it. "Aldous Briggs," Nash said, "you're under arrest for fraud in connection with land title documents, falsification of official county records, and unlawful modification of filed instruments." He kept his voice at the same official, unremarkable pitch he'd used in this office 2 days ago. "Mr. Crane, you can come along voluntarily, or you can make this complicated. That's your choice to make." Crane looked at Briggs. Briggs looked at the telegraph confirmation on the counter, and at the stack of documentation Margaret had placed beside it, and at Jesse Hargrove standing near the door with his arms at his sides. And he made the calculation that a man with a Denver syndicate behind him makes when he understands the local situation has become unrecoverable. He began thinking about how to make himself useful to the people who were going to prosecute him rather than to the people who'd funded him. "I'll need to speak with a lawyer," Briggs said. "That's your right," Nash said. "Whitfield here can serve in that capacity if he chooses, though I suspect he'll be wanting to clarify the precise nature of his involvement in today's counter-motion before he proceeds." Nash glanced at Whitfield. "That's a separate matter. For now, Mr. Briggs, let's go." They went. Crane went with them, which was either wisdom or resignation, or some combination of both. Whitfield gathered his papers with the efficient movements of a man who'd just decided that the party he'd traveled from San Angelo to represent was no longer a party he wished to be associated with, and followed them out without making eye contact with anyone. The office settled into a silence that felt after everything almost absurdly ordinary. Carey sat behind his counter with his hands flat on the surface and looked at Margaret with the expression of a man who'd just watched something historic happen in a room that usually only witnessed tax filings. "Well," he said. "The counter-motion," Margaret said. "I'll need it formally withdrawn from the record. I'll note it as superseded by the circuit court routing." He reached for his pen. "Should I note the circumstances?" "Note that the filing party's legal standing was confirmed by the presiding circuit judge subsequent to the submission. That's sufficient." She watched him write. "And Mr. Carey, the original deed documents that Briggs modified on Tuesday morning, the ones Henry Pratt preserved. Those need to go into protected evidence custody today." "I'll do it myself," he said. "Right now." She nodded and turned toward the door where Jesse was waiting. And as she crossed the room, she felt the precise weight of 3 days of almost no sleep, and 4 days of hard riding before that, and 6 years of moving from county to county, doing this work in rooms that didn't want her there, and she felt it not as exhaustion, but as the particular physical sensation of something, completed the way a long column of numbers felt when the final entry made the total balance. Jesse held the door for her. Outside, Nash was loading Briggs into his wagon with the help of his 19-year-old deputy, who was wide-eyed and doing his best, and Crane was standing with his wrists bound and his face empty in the way faces went empty when a man had stopped deciding things. Ezra was there. She hadn't seen him arrive, but Ezra arrived places the way weather arrived. You looked up, and it was simply present. He stood near the horses and looked at her, and looked at the scene in front of the sheriff's wagon, and looked back at her. "Done," he said. "The arrest is done. The case takes longer. But done enough for today." She considered that. Done enough for today. He nodded once, deeply satisfied, and untied the horses. They rode back to the ranch in the afternoon light, the 4 of them. Jesse, Margaret, Ezra, and Caleb, who had appeared from somewhere during the events, and attached himself to the group with the quiet determination of a young man who understood that history had just happened in his county and intended to be present for all of it. Nobody talked much on the ride. The particular silence of people who have been through something together and don't need to narrate it to each other. The ranch came into view as the sun was lowering, and there was smoke from the cookhouse, and horses in the corral, and the sound of men at end-of-day work, and it looked exactly as it had looked when Margaret had first ridden in 4 days ago. Except that now, she knew the name of every man in that yard, and the name of every problem the ranch carried, and the specific legal mechanism by which each of those problems was going to be addressed. Delia was on the porch, shading her eyes against the low sun, and she called something back into the house when she saw them coming. And by the time they reached the yard, the men were coming out to meet them with the expectant faces of people who'd been waiting for news and could read from the returning party's bearing that the news was going to be all right. Jesse told them. Plain and direct, the way he told everything. Briggs was arrested. The filing was protected. The properties were safe, pending the court proceeding. The Denver syndicate had lost their architect and their legal cover simultaneously, which meant their operation in West Texas was finished even if the formal proceedings took time. The yard received this information in the collective way that communities receive information, not all at once, but in waves, the understanding spreading from face to face as the implications landed. Caleb stood at the edge of it all, and Margaret watched him process the specific piece that was his. His father's land, the $40 borrowed against it, the conditional conveyance that Briggs had never gotten to execute, and watched the set of his shoulders change in the way shoulders changed when a weight was lifted from them. He caught her watching. He nodded. She nodded back. Later after the meal that Delia and 2 of the ranch hands produced from resources that shouldn't have stretched as far as they did after the conversations that ran long and celebratory, in the way they only ran when something had been genuinely won, after the men drifted back to the bunkhouse, and Delia to her quarters, and Ezra to wherever Ezra went. When the day was complete. Later, Jesse found Margaret on the porch where he'd found her the first night she'd stayed, except that now it was her standing there looking at the dark range rather than him. He stood beside her, close but not touching. The way they'd been finding their distance these past days, close enough that the distance was a choice rather than a default. Abernethy will want you in Abilene when the formal proceedings begin, she said. I know. The other 6 affected ranchers need to be notified individually. Someone needs to walk each of them through their situation and their options. That's weeks of work done properly. I know that too. She looked out at the dark. The water rights documentation for the historic corridor agreements. That needs to be formalized now while we have standing and goodwill. Verbal agreements don't survive the next generation, and the generation after you is going to need that water as much as you do. Margaret. And the ranch accounts. You're cutting costs where you should be investing, and investing where you should be cutting. I found 4 supply arrangements that are costing you double market rate. If you renegotiate those contracts before spring. Margaret. She stopped. He turned to face her, and she turned to face him, and the cold air moved between them, carrying the smell of horses and winter grass, and the particular emptiness of West Texas at night, which was not the emptiness of absence, but of space, enormous, indifferent, oddly comforting, once you stopped being frightened of it. I know you have reasons to leave, he said. I know you have work in other counties. I know staying is not something you've done in a long time, and I know it scares you more than Briggs or Luther Crane or a forged deed ever could. He held her gaze. I'm asking you anyway. She looked at this man who had taken her documents seriously from the moment he'd started reading them, who had not once asked her to explain herself differently or simplify her arguments or make herself smaller in any room they'd entered together, who had put himself between Crane and the door in a county clerk's office, not because she couldn't handle Crane, but because he'd decided without being asked that she shouldn't have to handle him alone. She thought about Clara, not with the usual weight, the guilt, the grief, the 6 years of carrying it like a stone in her chest. She thought about what she'd said in the hotel dining room. Stubborn, opinionated, remarkable. She thought about the fact that she had said those things out loud to another person, and the stone had not gotten heavier. It had impossibly gotten slightly less heavy than it had been before. She thought about the notebook in her coat pocket, and the documents on the kitchen table, and the filings stamped and in the system, and the 14 ranchers who were going to sleep safer tonight than they'd slept in 18 months, most of them not knowing why. She thought about what it meant to build something. Not the romantic version, not home as warmth and firelight and people who loved you. She'd learned not to trust that version because it was too fragile, and the world was not careful with fragile things. She thought about home as it actually was a place you'd put your hands on, a place where the work you did had accumulated into something with weight and permanence, a place where the people around you knew what you were actually capable of and had watched you be it. She had built that here in 4 days. She had built it out of ink and statute and a willingness to bleed on a stranger's table, and it had held. "Ask me to stay," she said. "Not tell me to, not assume I will. Ask me." "Stay," Jesse said. "Please." She looked at him for a long moment. The porch held them both in the cold November air of West Texas. A woman who had been running from grief for 6 years, and a man who had been standing still in his for 4. Both of them understanding that whatever came next was going to require more courage than either of them had needed to get here, and both of them finding with something that felt dangerously like relief that they were not afraid of it. "All right," she said. He pulled her in slowly, careful as a man who'd learned the cost of breaking things, and she let him, and they stood on the porch of the Hargrove Ranch while the dark range spread out before them, enormous and indifferent and full of space, and for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, the space felt like possibility instead of just emptiness. Behind them, the ranch breathed with the rhythm of people at rest. Men who still had their land. A family whose homestead was safe. A community that had been quietly hollowed out by one careful, corrupt man, and was now just as quietly beginning to fill back in. All of it held together by documents and stubbornness, and 2 people who had arrived at the same piece of ground from opposite directions and found it worth standing on. Margaret Calloway had ridden into Cutter's Creek with a bleeding hand and a forged deed, and 4 days of bad weather behind her, looking for nothing except the place where the next injustice needed correcting. She had found that, and she had corrected it, and in the process, she had found something she had stopped believing existed, a place she had put her hands on, and made better a man who had watched her do it, and asked her to stay, and for the first time in 6 years, a reason that was strong enough to make her answer yes. Some debts you paid with work, some wounds you carried until the carrying itself became a way of honoring what you'd lost, and some things, the rarest kind, you built from nothing but courage and competence and the stubborn refusal to let what was wrong continue unchallenged. And when you looked at what you'd built, you understood at last that home was never the place you came from. It was the place you were finally willing to fight for.